When I was in high school, I would often stop with my buddies when we would be walking past parked cars, and we would stop by these parked cars so that we could flex our arms in the reflection of the windows. Have you ever done this? You know, there are people who are like, no, but there are others who I know. For those of you who know, the windows on a car are curved so that if you were to flex your arm in the reflection, your arm looks wider than it would otherwise. And so my friends and I would do this to look at how strong we imagined we were. The problem, of course, is that it's not real. I was enjoying this distorted perspective on reality because it made me feel good about myself, even though I should have loved and appreciated my body just for being wonderfully made and mine. But in the depths of high school and in this image-based culture that we swim in, I wanted to see something that said I looked more like some imaginary ideal rather than face honesty. And we do that, don't we? Not just with parked cars and our imagined muscles. We can sequester ourselves into echo chambers that reinforce what we already want to hear. We look away from the things that make us uncomfortable. We can go to great lengths to avoid reality. We can avoid problems in the world and do very little to change any of them. This Sunday, we're starting a summer series on the minor prophets in the Hebrew Bible. Each week, in the church email, you will get a link as well to an overview video from the Bible Project about each book. And in your bulletin today, there's a little guideline of the minor prophets. So if you want this summer, you could read them yourselves. These prophets are so fascinating. There's 12 of them. They're called minor, but it's not because they're not important. They're just short at the end of the Hebrew Bible, and they challenge us. Each of them acts as a sort of mirror to us, a true mirror that shows us reality. Challenges us to see if reality matches what we say we believe or think. They challenge us to be honest about reality and decide what it means for us. Now, when we hear the word prophet today, we might think of future telling. But in the Bible, prophets are not so much interested in telling the future. They're more interested in telling the truth about reality. As former Pope Benedict once wrote, prophecy isn't about telling the future, but revealing the present. So in the scriptures, the prophets often begin their message with, "Thus says the Lord," and then they generally are challenging the reality that is around them. They hold up mirrors. Scholar Walter Brueggemann says, prophets criticize and energize. So as we engage these prophets, we will be challenged. Some of their criticism might be levied against us. We need to be open and hear it. But they will also energize us. And they will remind us who God is and what God says. They will be mirrors for us that aren't bent or curved, not distorted at all. Each week, we'll take on a new prophet. We'll learn about the big ideas and the big truths these poets and revolutionaries were pointing to with their words. And at the same time, we're going to put them in conversation with what I'm calling a modern saint. And I'm using the word saint in the broadest sense, the same way the Apostle Paul did when saying saints to describe the communities of Christians that Paul was writing to. We'll be putting these Hebrew Bible prophets in conversation with Christians from our more recent history who lived in a way that exemplified the message of each prophet. So over the summer, we'll be learning from a variety of voices. Saints like Mr. Rogers, activist Dorothy Day, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Rachel Held Evans, mother of modern nursing Florence Nightingale, who we'll look at today, Westchester's own Bayard Rustin. We'll put each of these in conversations with these prophets, and we'll see what God has to say. The first prophet we look to is Hosea, a peculiar prophet who lived in the southern kingdom after the north and south were split. But he lived right on the border of the northern kingdom, and most of his writing is about what's going on to the north. See, the north had been on the surface pretty successful. They had grown in power and in wealth. However, to gain their power and wealth, they were abandoning their character, who God had called them to be. They had made some shady alliances with their neighbors, including one neighbor, the Assyrians, who would eventually wipe them out. Hosea is writing to challenge the northern kingdom in their willingness to disregard their worship of God and instead rely on these other nations for their own security. And as they are relying on these other nations, they also begin to take up the practices of these other nations, including disregarding the poor, self-advancement, the worship of other gods. See, they've begun sacrificing their integrity and the way they're called to worship God for the sake of money and power and security. They trust their politics and their alliances over God. That would never happen to us, right? And while they have kept up their appearances of their faith, Hosea sees the reality around them and warns them that the path they're on will lead to disappointment and destruction. So, in the book of Hosea, the first 3 chapters are an allegory from Hosea's life. And then from there we find more applications of what Hosea sees throughout the rest of the book. So we'll first look at these 2 verses that Amanda read first, Hosea 1 and 2. The text says, "The word of the Lord came to Hosea, son of Beeri, in the days of the king Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah of Judah, in the days of King Jeroboam, son of Joash of Israel. And when the Lord first spoke through Hosea, the Lord said to Hosea, 'Go and take for yourself a wife of prostitution and have children of prostitution, for the land commits great prostitution by forsaking the Lord.'" What a start, right? I feel, every time I pick these texts, I feel for our people who are like, how do we do a children's message with it? Just don't. Just pick a different text. It's okay. Hosea tells this allegorical account of being called to marry a woman who is unfaithful. The NRSV translates this as prostitution, but really there's no evidence that his wife is a sex worker. His wife Gomer instead is described more as unfaithful, and that word can mean unfaithful that we find here. And the story is just trying to get these people in the northern kingdom to think about their own unfaithfulness to God like an unfaithful spouse. Admittedly, when we read Hosea today, it can make us a little uncomfortable, especially since this allegory places Hosea, the man, as a symbol for God, and Gomer, the woman, as a symbol for the sinner. That's uncomfortable. But the story is not at all about the gender of the characters. It's about the reality of the faithfulness of the people. See, Hosea is comparing all of the northern kingdom, especially the leaders and the religious leaders, with Gomer, to challenge them to think about their own faithfulness to God. And it should challenge us too. Are we faithful? That's the first challenge brought forth by Hosea. As Christians, faithfulness means that we live willing to live in the way of Jesus, the way Jesus showed us how to live. Are we faithful? I mean, it's easy for us to say the right things, to say, I love God, but then we might treat our neighbors poorly because we love our own sense of self-importance more. Or to immerse ourselves in busyness or the things that keep us neglecting others and even our own souls. How are we using our lives? How are we acting for our neighbors, each other? Are we orienting our lives around God or something else? Here at BCWC, we say we value Christ-centered living. It's one of our core values. Is Christ the center? A question we should be asking all the time. Or is it something else? In 1820, Florence Nightingale was born to a wealthy British family. The expectation for her like young women who grew up on large estates at the time, perhaps like Downton Abbey, would be to maintain the social status she had been given, to keep a fancy house and to have children. But for Florence, from even a young age, she was disinterested in all of that. She found herself to be socially awkward and not interested in all the social gatherings. She found joy in helping others, especially those who had the least. She also loved to learn at a time when it was not that common for young women to be able to learn all that they wanted to, but her father believed in educating his daughters. So she learned multiple languages, and philosophy and writing and math, and she really loved math. When she was 17, she was proposed to by a young man who fit all the cultural expectations, and she told him no. She decided instead she wanted to go and get more education, specifically in nursing, and so she did. In fact, she said she felt what she would describe as a divine call from God to this work. In her diary, she wrote these words, "God called me in the morning and asked that I would do good for him." So she did. And during the Crimean War, Nightingale went on to be the first female to run a field hospital. And when she got to the hospital, she found that soldiers were dying from diseases like typhoid at a higher rate than they were dying from their wounds. The hospital she became in charge of was built over a cesspool. It was confined, it was full of rats and dirty water, so she overhauled the whole thing. She demanded fresh air and clean linens, and she tried this new idea that people weren't so sure about, washing your hands. The death rate at her hospital went from 40% to 2%. After the war, using the math and the data and the statistics that she loved, she showed what might happen if they reformed the hospital systems in her nation. She wrote a nursing textbook. She helped influence legislation that demanded for better public sanitation and hygiene practices. It's estimated now that the changes that she led meant that the average British citizen went to live 20 years longer. Because a 17-year-old girl, similar age to those who graduated and we celebrate today, heard a call from God to do good. And her understanding of this God demanded that she care for those who were hurting, that she could use her brain and her talents to challenge those in power for the good of those who served those in power. She saw herself, saw reality around her, and lived willing to follow God for the sake of her neighbors. I mentioned how for us today, we might be uncomfortable with the beginning image in Hosea's story, but it's not the only image. Amanda also read from chapter 11, I think one of the most beautiful passages about the character of God in the Bible. I want to read just some of it now. Hosea 11, verse 1, "When Israel was a child, I loved him. Out of Egypt I called my son. The more I called them, the more they went from me. They kept sacrificing to Baals and offering incense to idols. But I was the one who taught Ephraim to walk. I took them up in my arms, but they did not know that I healed them. I led them with cords of human kindness, with bands of love. I was to them like those who lift infants to their cheeks. I bent down and fed them." And jumping down to verse 8, "How can I give up on you, O Ephraim?" Another name for the nation. "How can I hand you over, O Israel, make you like Admah, treat you like Zeboim? My heart recoils within me, my compassion grows warm and tender. I will not execute my fierce anger. I will not again destroy Ephraim, for I am God and no mortal. The Holy One in your midst, I will not come in wrath." Hosea, who has lived a message, now shares a message from the Lord about how God is like a loving parent. God reminds them of the days they first escaped slavery in Egypt, how it was God who taught the people to walk, God who bent down and cared for them and fed them like you would care for an infant, nursed them to health, even when they didn't realize they were being cared for. This image of God is God, the good parent, God, the nurse, God that loves and bends down and stoops low And this shows us something about God we might not expect, a God that is so moved by compassion that even though the people in the text are launching themselves toward destruction, God will keep pursuing them. Even though they heap consequences on themselves, God will not give up on them. It's a similar message to the story of the prodigal son that Jesus told, where the father, representing God, runs and restores the wayward child. Hosea has spent much of this book critiquing the faithfulness of the people, but now Hosea energizes us with the picture of a God who refuses to give up on us. Later in life, Florence Nightingale struggled with pain and illness, but through it all she carried a deep faith. And a story is told that once she was comforting a woman who had been a sex worker and was now dying of an illness. The woman was afraid of what might happen to her at her death. She worried what God might say to her or do to her. And Nightingale said to her, "Oh, my girl, are you not now more merciful than the God you think you're going to? The real God is far more merciful than any human creature was or could ever imagine." "How could I give up on you?" asked the Lord. The criticisms are valid. We've not loved like we should. The church globally has done things wrong often. We have often fallen short. We can be selfish and unmotivated and uncaring and cruel. We can and must see the reality about this and see the call to do something about it, but be encouraged. The real God is far more merciful than any human creature ever was or can even imagine. How can I give up on you, says the Lord. I told you about Hosea at the beginning, this call to marry this unfaithful wife. After they're married, the story goes, she continues to be unfaithful and she runs off. All the things that she pursued that she thought would be better turn out to be terrible. And she ends up in some kind of enslavement. And then we read this in Hosea 3, 1 and 2. "The Lord said to me again, go and love a woman who has a lover and is an adulteress, just as the Lord loves the people of Israel. Though they turn to other gods and love raisin cakes." That's a weird line. It has something to do with how they worshipped at the time they used raisin cakes and worshiping the other gods. It doesn't matter. Verse 2, So I bought her for 15 shekels of silver and a homer of barley and a measure of wine. The Lord speaks again to Hosea and says, "To that wife that abandoned you, go back." Now, this is an allegory to teach us about us and God, not an argument to return to an unhealthy relationship. You might need to hear that today. But can you imagine what it was like when Gomer saw Hosea? I mean, she's now being trafficked. She's for sale. And this husband that she has hurt and abandoned approaches her. I wonder what she thought. Is she ashamed or afraid? If she, like the woman who was so afraid with Florence Nightingale about what might happen to her, perhaps she wonders, what will this man do to me? The text says he paid 15 shekels of silver, a homer of barley, a measure of wine. We don't know really what that means in our world when we read it, but scholars tell us that this is most likely the common price for a bride price. A huge amount that you would have given at this time to a family before a wedding. The allegory shows a radical compassion. What seems like an exorbitant expense paid. A God who would do whatever it takes for you and me. I can't read this story. I can't see that phrase, "How can I give up on you?" and not see our Jesus seeing us. With all our failures and rebellions and mistakes, all our insecurities and fears, all the fake mirrors we go to so we can lie to ourselves, and the lies that we believe that tell us we don't matter, we can't have hope. The story of Christianity is the story of God, saying, "I'll do whatever it takes. I'll take on flesh. I'll lay down my life. I'll go to a cross. Anything, everything for you. How can I give up on you?" So yeah, Hosea criticizes us for putting trust and hope in all kinds of things and stuff that will disappoint. But Hosea energizes. Because the God that we discover in these pages is the same God we discover in Jesus, who will not give up on you. You don't need any fake mirrors to tell you that you're valuable. You don't need curved windows. May we see ourselves instead in the light of Christ. May we see each other in the light of Christ. May we see the love that God has for each and every one of us. And if God won't give up on this woman, if God won't give up on these religious leaders who put security or self or greed or politics or their own selfish means over God and others, who will God give up on? How can we continue to live as people who criticize when needed, but energize each other with the love that is for all?
Hey, I'm Evan Duncan, the senior pastor of the Baptist Church of Westchester, and I'm so glad you found us on YouTube. I just want to thank you for engaging with us. If there is more you want to know about our church, about ways to connect, or even if you want to support the work of God in our community, you can visit bcwc.org. That's also how you can connect with us. As you go, I want to share with you a blessing, a benediction that comes out of this book, A Common Prayer, a Liturgy for Ordinary Radicals. May the peace of the Lord Jesus Christ go with you wherever he may send you. May he guide you in the wilderness, protect you through the storms. May he bring you home rejoicing at the wonders he has shown you. May he bring you home rejoicing once again